Redditor 1. I've been putting off writing this for months now. Every time I sit down to type it out, my hands start shaking. The cursor blinks accusingly on the blank screen, demanding that I finally share what happened that night on Crescent Beach. My therapist says it might help to get it all down, to give shape to the formless terror that's been haunting my dreams. So here goes. It started as such a normal night. That's what makes it worse, somehow. Sarah had just gotten her acceptance letter to med school, so we decided to celebrate with an impromptu late-night beach walk, just the three of us, Anna, Marco, and me. We'd been doing these walks since high school, usually after major life events or when one of us needed to process something heavy. The rhythm of the waves always helped clear our heads. The beach was empty at 1 a.m., which wasn't unusual for a Wednesday in October. The air had that specific autumn-by-the-sea quality, crisp enough to need light jackets, but not truly cold. A three-quarter moon hung above, partially obscured by wispy clouds that drifted across its face like smoke. We were talking about Anna's upcoming move to Boston, trying to figure out how often we could visit. Marco was suggesting road trip routes, mapping out stops along the way. Normal conversation. Important conversation. The kind that makes you feel like maybe growing up and growing apart isn't so scary after all. That's when I saw it. Just a flicker in my peripheral vision at first. Something that didn't quite match the natural movement of waves or clouds. I almost didn't mention it. But then it shifted again, and this time I was sure. "Hey," I said, touching Anna's arm. "Do you see that?" She followed my pointing finger and I heard her sharp intake of breath. Marco stopped mid-sentence about some diner in Connecticut he wanted us to try. 4 dots hung in the air maybe 500 feet out over the water. They glowed a warm orange color that reminded me of old vacuum tubes in antique radios, the kind my grandfather used to collect. They were arranged in a perfect square, completely motionless. "What the hell?" Marco whispered. That's when I notice the silence. Living near the ocean, you get used to constant background noise. Waves breaking, seabirds calling, the distant hum of boats or traffic from the coastal highway. But in that moment, everything went dead quiet. Even the waves seemed muted, like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the world. We stood frozen, watching. The dots remained perfectly still for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt much longer. I remember thinking they looked almost deliberate in their stillness, like they were studying us just as intently as we were studying them. Then, without warning, they moved. Each dot shot off in a different direction, north, south, east, west. Faster than anything I've ever seen. 1 second they were there, the next they were gone, leaving only after images dancing in my vision. That should have been the end of it. A weird experience, sure, but one we could laugh about later. Maybe even convince ourselves it had been drones, or some kind of military exercise, or a trick of the light. But 3 days later, Anna went missing. She was supposed to meet us for coffee that Saturday morning. When she didn't show, we figured she'd overslept. But she wasn't at her apartment. Her car was in the driveway, her phone on the kitchen counter. No signs of forced entry, no note, no nothing. The police investigated, of course. They interviewed everyone, checked security cameras, put up posters, but they found nothing. It was like she'd simply vanished into thin air. That's when the dreams started. In them, I'm back on that beach, but I'm alone. The 4 orange dots appear, but instead of shooting away, they come closer. In the dreams, I can see what they really are. I wake up screaming every time, but I can never remember what I saw. Just that terrible orange glow. Marco started having the dreams too. We'd text each other at 3 a.m., both wide awake, both afraid to go back to sleep. He became convinced that the dots were connected to Anna's disappearance. Started researching UFO sightings, missing persons cases, anything that might give us answers. 2 weeks after Anna disappeared, Marco called me at midnight. He was breathing hard, almost hyperventilating. "How bad is that?" he said. "The docks. They're outside my window." I told him to stay put, that I'd be there in 10 minutes. It was only a 5-minute drive to his place, but when I arrived, his apartment was empty, just like Anna's had been. Phone on the counter, car in the driveway, no signs of struggle. That was 6 months ago. The police have found nothing. They think Anna and Marco ran away together, despite all evidence to the contrary. They don't want to hear about orange dots or impossible silences. I've moved inland since then, as far from the beach as I could get while still keeping my job. I installed blackout curtains on all my windows. I don't go out at night anymore, but it doesn't matter. Because last night I saw them again. Not in a dream this time. I was washing dishes when movement caught my eye through the kitchen window. 4 orange dots, arranged in a perfect square, hovering just outside. They stayed there for 30 seconds. Exactly 30 seconds. I counted every moment, my hands gripping the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles went white. Then they split apart, each one shooting off in a different direction. Except for one. The dot that went west paused for a moment, and I swear it turned to look at me. Somehow I knew it was looking at me, even though it was just a point of light. Then it was gone. I'm writing this now because I know they're coming back. I can feel it. The silence is creeping in around the edges of my house. The kind of silence that swallowed the waves that night. The kind of silence that came before Anna and Marco disappeared. I don't know what they want. I don't know why they took my friends. I don't know why they left me for last. But I know they're coming. Maybe someone will find this and understand what happened to us. Maybe someone will finally believe. The dots are back now, outside my window. Still that same soft orange glow, like old vacuum tubes, like dying suns. They're not arranged in a square this time. They're forming an arrow, pointing right at me. I can hear the silence coming. End of document. Found on Lauren Chen's laptop, October 15, 2024, MS. Chen has not been seen since. Her case remains open. Redditor 2. I've carried this memory for 30 years. Letting it gather dust in the darkest corners of my mind. But lately the dreams have returned. Dreams of that impossible moment when time stood still and reality cracked open like an egg. I need to write it down, if only to convince myself that I'm not crazy. That what happened that autumn day in rural Ontario wasn't just the product of a 5-year-old's overactive imagination. The year was 1993. And our family had just moved into an old farmhouse surrounded by fields of swaying corn. My brothers and I, 5, 7, and 7, spent every moment we could outdoors, away from the creaky floorboards and strange shadows that seemed to follow us through the house. That particular afternoon, we were tossing around a mini football on the front lawn, our breath visible in the crisp October air. I remember every detail with a clarity that haunts me. The way the wind whipped through the corn, creating that distinctive rustle that sounds almost like whispered conversations. The smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. The heavy gray clouds racing across the sky, promising rain but never quite delivering. We stood in a triangle, our usual formation, with me closest to the gravel driveway, Tommy near the ancient maple tree, and Michael closer to the house. The football was brown and white, one of those cheap foam ones you could get at any department store. It had a slight tear on one end where our dog had tried to claim it as his own. We'd been playing for maybe 20 minutes, our cheeks red from the wind and exertion, when it happened. Michael had just thrown the ball in my direction, its wobbling spiral cutting through the air. I remember tracking it, my small hands already reaching up to catch it, when everything stopped. The silence hit first. It wasn't just quiet. It was the complete absence of sound. Like someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. The wind died instantly, leaving the world in perfect stillness. The football hung suspended about 6 feet off the ground, defying gravity as casually as you might ignore a stop sign. My first thought, oddly enough, was that I'd gone deaf. I snapped my fingers next to my ear, but even that made no sound. That's when the real fear began to creep in, starting as a cold knot in my stomach and spreading outward until my whole body felt like ice. I turned to look at Michael and he was frozen mid-throw, his face locked in that slight grimace of concentration he always had when playing sports. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. He looked like a photograph, a perfect 3-dimensional snapshot of my brother, caught in an impossible moment. Then I saw Tommy. The light, God, the light. It was like nothing I've ever seen before or since. A perfect cylinder of brilliance that engulfed him completely, stretching up into the sky further than my eyes could follow. It wasn't like sunlight or artificial light. It had a quality that seemed almost liquid, like molten metal but pure white. Tommy stood within it, his head tilted back, staring up into its source with an expression I still see in my nightmares. His face wasn't afraid, it wasn't anything. It was empty, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made him Tommy, leaving just a shell behind. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, reflecting that impossible light like mirrors. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, I wanted to do anything except stand there and watch, but my body wouldn't respond. It wasn't frozen like my brother's. I could move, I could think, but terror had turned my legs to lead and stolen my voice. Time became meaningless. It could have been seconds or hours that I stood there, watching my brother commune with whatever force had claimed him. The air felt thick, like trying to breathe underwater, and there was a pressure in my head that made my thoughts fuzzy around the edges. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The wind returned with a violence that nearly knocked me over. Sound crashed back into the world like a physical force. The rustling corn, a distant car engine, the cry of a startled crow. The football dropped straight down, hitting the grass with a soft thump, all its momentum gone as if it had never been thrown. Michael stumbled slightly, catching his balance. Tommy blinked rapidly, shaking his head like he was trying to clear it. Neither of them seemed to realize anything had happened. But I knew, and I saw the way Tommy's eyes had changed. They were still his eyes, still the same deep brown they'd always been, but something about them was different, older. Like he'd seen things no 7-year-old was meant to see. We never talked about it, not then. What could we say? How do you put words to something that shouldn't be possible? We went inside, had dinner, watched TV, lived our lives as if that afternoon had been like any other. But I noticed things in the weeks and months that followed. Tommy started sleeping with his blinds open, staring up at the night sky for hours before finally drifting off. He developed an obsession with astronomy, filling notebooks with drawings of constellations and complicated calculations that seemed beyond his years. And sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, I'd catch him standing in the backyard, head tilted back, waiting. It wasn't until we were adults, sharing beers around a campfire at Michael's wedding, that I finally worked up the courage to mention it. Michael had no memory of that day, but Tommy went very quiet, his fingers tightening around his bottle until I thought it might shatter. "I remember," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember everything." He wouldn't say more, wouldn't explain what he'd seen or felt or learned in that pillar of light. But sometimes I catch him looking up at the sky with that same empty expression, and I know he's thinking about it, waiting for it to happen again. I've spent years trying to rationalize it. Ball lightning, temporal lobe epilepsy, shared hallucination. I've researched every possible explanation. None of them fit. None of them explain why, on perfectly clear nights, I sometimes see lights moving in patterns no aircraft could achieve. Why Tommy's son, born just last year, sometimes stares up at the ceiling and laughs at nothing, reaching toward empty air with such certainty. And then, I know what I saw that day, I know it was real, but knowledge isn't understanding, and some questions don't have answers we're equipped to comprehend. All I can do is write this down, share my truth, and hope that somewhere, someone else has seen the light. And if you're reading this, if you've experienced something similar, I have just one piece of advice. Don't look up. Don't look up, because sometimes, when you stare into the light, it stares back. Read to your 3. I've been holding on to this story for 12 years now. Sometimes I wonder if sharing it will make the memories less intense, or if putting it into words will only make it more real. But I need someone else to know what happened that summer night at Willow Creek Park. I was 14 then, spending most of my time with my best friend Sarah. We were in that strange space between childhood and whatever comes next, testing boundaries with stolen cigarettes and staying out later than we should. The park was our sanctuary, especially at night when the summer heat finally broke and the crickets took over. That particular night started like any other. Sarah and I had snuck out after her parents went to bed, making our way to the park under a blanket of stars. The streetlights ended about a block before the park's entrance, and we navigated the familiar path by memory and moonlight. The chain-link fence that surrounded the playground equipment threw spindly shadows across the patchy grass. "We should head to Amy's house around 11, Sarah said, pulling out her beat-up flip phone to check the time. "She's having people over while her parents are at their lake house." I nodded, fishing in my pocket for the pack of Marlboros we'd bummed from her older brother. The lighter's flame danced in the still air as we settled onto our usual bench. The night was unusually quiet. No distant traffic, no dogs barking, not even the usual chorus of crickets. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. That's when we heard it. The sound started as a low hum, like a massive engine idling somewhere above us. But then it changed, transforming into something I can only describe as mechanical moaning. A grinding, whirring noise that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Sarah's hand found mine in the dark, squeezing so hard it hurt. "What the fuck is that?" she whispered, but I couldn't answer. My eyes were fixed on something emerging from behind the tree line. It moved slowly, deliberately, a dark, rhombus-shaped mass blocking out the stars. The edges were lined with what looked like metal ribs, pulsing with dim lights that seemed to shift between blue and green. It was massive, bigger than a car, bigger than a truck, and it was passing directly over our heads, barely clearing the tops of the trees. We didn't run. We couldn't. We just stood there, frozen, watching this impossible thing drift overhead. The air felt charged, like right before a lightning strike, and I swear I could taste metal on my tongue. Time seemed to stretch and warp. I don't know if we stood there for 5 minutes or 50. When the object finally disappeared behind the recreation center, the spell broke. We ran to Sarah's house, our feet pounding against the pavement in perfect sync. Neither of us spoke. What could we possibly say? Back in her bedroom, we sat on the floor, trying to process what we'd seen. The digital clock on her nightstand read 9:47 p.m. Outside, the neighborhood seemed eerily still, like someone had pressed pause on the world. No car alarms, no slamming doors, no voices floating from open windows. Just that oppressive silence. "We should call Amy," Sarah finally said, her voice shaky. "Tell her we're not coming." I nodded, but before she could dial, we heard something that made my blood run cold. A wet, squelching sound, like someone walking through mud, except there hadn't been rain in weeks. It was coming from right outside Sarah's window. Squish, 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 so. We scrambled away from the window, backing toward her bedroom door. The footsteps stopped directly beneath her second-story window, and for a moment, I swore I could hear something breathing. A raspy, filtered sound, like someone using an oxygen mask. We fled downstairs to the living room, turning on every light we passed. Sarah's parents were heavy sleepers, thank God, because we weren't exactly being quiet anymore. We huddled on the couch, jumping at every creak and groan of the house settling. What felt like minutes later, Sarah's phone displayed 11:52 p.m. Somehow, 2 hours had vanished. We had no memory of what we'd done during that time, just a vague sense of sitting there, waiting for something. The phone rang, making us both scream. It was Amy. "Are you guys? Everyone's here and your phones have been going straight to voicemail." Sarah put her on speaker. "Amy, something really weird is happening. We saw something at the park and now—" "We're coming over," Amy interrupted. "Jake's brother can drive us. You two sound seriously freaked out." 20 minutes later, Amy and 3 others arrived. We tried to explain what we'd seen, but it came out jumbled and impossible sounding. Jake's brother Marcus, usually the first to crack jokes, just listened with an increasingly troubled expression. "My dad works at the airport," he finally said. "He texted me earlier about weird radar readings, but they were told to keep quiet about it." We stayed up until dawn, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, painting Sarah's living room in pale gold, we decided to go back to the park. Safety in numbers, we told ourselves, though none of us really believed it. The park looked different in the morning light. The chain-link fence around the playground was bent inward at the top, like something heavy had pressed down on it from above. But that wasn't the strangest part. Scattered across the ground, concentrated in a perfect circle about 20 feet in diameter, were hundreds of clothing tags. Not just any tags, they were all identical, white with black text, but the writing wasn't in any language we recognized. The symbols seemed to shift and change if you looked at them too long. Later that day, the local news ran a brief story about unusual aerial phenomena spotted over the city. They attributed it to debris from the International Space Station catching the light. The story ran for exactly 2 minutes, and they never mentioned it again. We collected some of the tags, but they disappeared from Sarah's desk drawer the next day. The bent fence was replaced within a week. No one else seemed to remember the strange silence that fell over the neighborhood that night. But sometimes, on quiet summer nights, I still hear that wet, squelching sound outside my window. And every time I check my clothes for tags, I can't shake the feeling that something out there is cataloging us, marking us, preparing us for what? I'm 26 now, and I still don't smoke anymore. Neither does Sarah. The smell of cigarettes brings back too many memories of that night, of the moment when our world tilted sideways and never quite straightened again. We don't talk about it much anymore, but sometimes I'll catch her eye when a plane flies overhead, and I know she's remembering too. The tags, the silence, the missing time, it all adds up to something I'm not ready to face. But I know what I saw that night at Willow Creek Park, and I know that somewhere out there, in the vast darkness between the stars, something knows exactly what I am. I just hope they never come back to collect. Redditor for it. I've held on to this story for 5 years, turning it over in my mind like a smooth stone that reveals new, unsettling details with each examination. Even now, as I write this, I catch myself glancing at my phone, wondering if I should call Elsa and ask him again about that night. But I know what he'll say. The same thing he's said since it happened. I don't remember. It was Elsa's 55th birthday. My uncle had always been the kind of man who preferred simplicity. He lived out in the country, about 90 minutes from the city, in a modest house surrounded by dense woodland. The property wasn't much, but it was his sanctuary. The trees grew so thick around the house that even on the brightest summer days, the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. The party was his wife Maria's idea. 55 isn't just any birthday, she'd insisted over family dinner a month prior. We need to celebrate. Elsa had smiled and nodded, though I caught the slight tension in his shoulders. He'd never been one for crowds. The day of the party was unusually warm for September. I arrived early to help set up, watching as Maria transformed their small backyard into a festive space with string lights and folding tables. By 6 o'clock, about 50 people had arrived. Family, neighbors, old colleagues. The air filled with laughter and the smell of grilled meat, while children darted between the adults like schools of fish. I remember seeing Elsa moving through the crowd, accepting birthday wishes with his characteristic quiet grace. He wore a blue-checked shirt, pressed clean but with sleeves rolled up against the heat. Something seemed off about him, though. He kept rubbing his arms, especially near the elbows, as if trying to ease an ache. "You okay, Uncle?" I'd asked him when he stopped by the cooler where I was restocking drinks. "Just getting old," he'd laughed, but there was an undertone to his voice I couldn't place. "Arms have been bothering me lately. Probably arthritis setting in." The party stretched into the evening. The string lights cast strange shadows through the trees, and the woods beyond the yard seemed to grow darker and more imposing. My aunts had complained about the single bathroom in the house, and some of the women had taken to using the cover of bushes at the edge of the property, something about it being just like camping. I lost track of Elsa around 9. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but there were still plenty of people milling about. It wasn't until nearly 11, when most guests had left, that Maria approached me with worry etched on her face. "Have you seen Elsa?" she asked, her eyes scanning the remaining partygoers. "I haven't been able to find him for at least an hour." We started asking around. Nobody remembered seeing him recently. His car was still in the driveway. His phone went straight to voicemail. What began as concern quickly escalated into panic as we searched the house and immediate surroundings with flashlights. The police arrived shortly after midnight. They took statements, organized search parties. Days passed. The woods were combed. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the area. Missing person posters appeared in shop windows in town. Maria barely slept, convinced she'd hear him coming up the driveway at any moment. It was on the 4th day that we found him. I was part of the volunteer search team that morning. The air was thick with humidity, and the ground was still wet from an overnight rain. We were checking an area of dense brush about a 1/4 mile from the house. an area that had supposedly been searched before, when someone shouted. Elsa was lying face down in the undergrowth, his blue-checked shirt now stained with mud and something darker. He was alive but unresponsive. When we turned him over, his arms were crossed over his chest in an unnatural position, like a pharaoh in a sarcophagus. The paramedics arrived within 20 minutes. As they loaded him into the ambulance, he began to stir, crying out about his arms. "They're burning," he kept saying. "God, they're burning inside." At the hospital, the doctors initially suspected exposure, dehydration, maybe a fall that had left him confused and injured. But Elsa's only complaint was about his arms. The pain seemed to be getting worse, not better, even with medication. That's when they ordered the x-rays. I was in the waiting room with Maria when the doctor called us in to look at the images. He pointed to clear, geometric shapes visible in both of Elsa's arms. Surgical plates, running along the bones from just below the shoulder to just above the elbow. These are high-grade medical implants, the doctor explained, her brow furrowed. Titanium alloy from the look of them, very sophisticated work. She turned to Maria. "You said your husband has never had surgery?" Maria shook her head. "Never. Not even a broken bone." The doctor called in specialists. More x-rays were taken, CT scans, MRIs. The plates were definitely there, definitely real, definitely surgical in nature. But there were no surgical scars, no evidence of how they'd been implanted. The skin was unbroken. They kept him for observation, ran tests for drugs, toxins, anything that might explain the 4-day gap in his memory. Everything came back normal except for elevated white blood cell counts around the implants, as if his body was fighting their presence. Elsa recovered, physically at least. The pain in his arms gradually subsided to a dull ache. He went home after a week, but something had changed in him. He sold the house within a month. "Couldn't stand to look at the woods anymore," he said. They moved into a condo in the city where the only trees are in concrete planters. He's never remembered what happened during those 4 days. Sometimes, when we're together at family gatherings, I catch him absently rubbing his arms, his fingers tracing the paths where we know those mysterious plates lie beneath his skin. The doctors have suggested removing them, but Elsa always refuses. "They're part of me now," he says, with a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. Last Christmas, after a few drinks, he confided something to me. He said sometimes, late at night, he dreams of lights in the woods, of voices speaking words he can't understand, of cold metal and warm hands. But most disturbing of all, he dreams of others out there, walking around with similar implants, their arms aching with the same mysterious purpose. "The worst part," he whispered, leaning close, "is that I think they're waiting for something. And whatever it is, it's getting closer." I don't visit Elsa as often as I should anymore. It's not because I don't care. It's because every time I see him, I can't help but notice how he keeps checking his arms, like he's listening for something. And lately, I've started to wonder if maybe he is. The doctors never could explain those metal plates. They're still there, visible on every x-ray, defying medical explanation. But sometimes I think about all those people at the party, about my aunts who ventured into the dark woods to use the bathroom, about how many of them have complained of aching arms since that night. I wonder how many of them have never had an x-ray. I wonder how many of them are waiting too. Redditor 5. I've carried this story inside me for 14 years, letting it gnaw at my bones like a hungry thing. Every time I see those ethereal green ribbons dancing in the night sky on the news or social media, my throat closes up and my hands start to shake. My wife thinks I'm just being dramatic when I draw the curtains on crystal clear winter nights, but she wasn't there. She didn't see what we saw. Back then, our family ranch sprawled across 200 acres of pristine British Columbia wilderness. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down an unpaved road, and the closest town was an hour's drive through dense forest. Most people would have found the isolation unsettling, but to us, it was home. The vast emptiness of the land, the way the stars seemed close enough to touch on cloudless nights, these things were as natural as breathing. That night started like any other in late September. I was 17, more interested in my phone than the world around me, but Dad had insisted we all come outside to watch the aurora. "It's going to be a good one," he'd said at dinner, studying the space weather report on his tablet. The solar activity is perfect. Might even hear them sing." Mom brought out thick wool blankets and thermoses of hot chocolate, arranging everything on our weather-beaten deck chairs. My little sister Emma, 12 at the time, bounced around with barely contained excitement. She'd been doing a science project on the Northern Lights and had spent weeks hoping to hear their mysterious crackling sound that only appears during the strongest displays. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and our breath came out in white puffs that dissipated into the darkness. Above us, the first hints of green began to appear, like watercolor paint bleeding across black paper. We settled into our chairs, wrapped in blankets, our faces tilted skyward. "Daryl," Emma whispered fiercely as the first faint crackle reached our ears. It sounded like static electricity, like cellophane being crumpled very far away. The lights intensified, sheets of green and purple rippling overhead like cosmic curtains stirred by an alien wind. Dad passed around the hot chocolate, and for a while we just sat in comfortable silence, watching nature's greatest light show. The crackling grew louder, almost like the snap and pop of a campfire. I remember thinking how strange it was that such enormous things happening hundreds of miles above us could make such delicate sounds. "Hey," Dad said suddenly, pointing toward the western edge of the display. "What's that?" At first I didn't see what he was talking about. The aurora was particularly bright in that direction, a violent swirl of green that hurt my eyes if I looked at it too long. Then I noticed it, a pinprick of pure white light, steady and unwavering, unlike the shifting curtains around it. "Probably just a satellite," Mom said, but there was something uncertain in her voice. The white light seemed too bright, too focused, like a spotlight pointing straight down at us. Emma grabbed my arm. "Look, it's moving." The light began to drift sideways, and that's when we realized it wasn't above the aurora at all. It was beneath it. My mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A helicopter, maybe? But there was no sound, no whoomp-whoomp of rotors cutting through the night air, just that strange, persistent crackling of the lights above. The white light stopped moving horizontally and hung there for a moment, pulsing slightly. The air felt different suddenly, heavier, charged with electricity. The hair on my arm stood up under my jacket sleeves. Then it happened. The light shot upward with impossible speed, straight toward the curtain of aurora above. As it approached, something began to happen to the lights. They started to tear apart. There's no other way to describe it. It was like watching fabric rip in slow motion, jagged edges peeling back to reveal nothing. Not stars, not space, just absolute perfect darkness. The white light passed through this hole, and for a split second, I swear I saw something else. Shapes in that darkness, geometric patterns that hurt my eyes and made my head spin. The crackling sound cut off abruptly, leaving us in total silence. The tear in the aurora sealed itself immediately, the edges knitting back together as if nothing had happened, but the damage was done. We'd seen something we weren't supposed to see, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. Dad was the first to move. "Inside," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Everyone inside, now!" We grabbed the blankets and thermoses, almost tripping over each other in our haste to get back to the house. Once inside, Dad locked the door, something I'd never seen him do before, and drew all the curtains. We sat in the living room until dawn, nobody willing to go to bed, nobody willing to talk about what we'd seen. The next morning, Dad called the local weather station and a nearby university's astronomy department. Nobody reported anything unusual. The aurora had been particularly strong, they said, but that was all. When he tried to describe what we'd seen, they politely suggested it might have been a weather balloon or some atmospheric phenomenon we'd misidentified. But I know what I saw. We all do. Here's what keeps me awake at night, 14 years later. What if the northern lights aren't just particles interacting with our magnetic field? What if there's something else? A barrier, maybe, or a curtain hiding something from our view? And what if, sometimes, things from the other side find ways to slip through? I've researched obsessively over the years, looking for similar stories. There are a few vague accounts of lights behaving strangely during strong auroral displays, of geometric patterns and tears in the sky. Most are dismissed as hoaxes or hallucinations. But I know better now. Last week, I received a letter from Emma. She's working at an atmospheric research station in Alaska now, studying aurora patterns. The envelope contained a single photograph and a short note. I found something in the data. The tears are appearing more frequently. They're getting bigger. The photo showed a familiar pattern of jagged lines cutting through a computer visualization of aurora activity. In the corner, barely visible, was a familiar white light. I haven't responded to her letter yet. Part of me wants to tell her to stop looking, to come home, to forget about whatever lies behind that shimmering curtain in the sky. But a larger part of me knows it's too late. We saw behind the veil that night, and now we can never unsee it. The northern lights still dance above my old home in northern BC. Sometimes, on clear nights, I can see their faint glow from my apartment in the city. I always close my curtains and turn up the TV to drown out any chance of hearing that familiar, crackling sound. Because I know now that the lights aren't just watching us, they're listening. And sometimes, when conditions are just right, they open up to let things through. Things that shouldn't be here. Things that slip through tears in reality itself. I haven't watched the northern lights since that night 14 years ago. And if you're smart, you won't either. Because once you see what's behind them, once you understand what they really are, you'll never look at the night sky the same way again. And somewhere out there, that white light is still moving, still searching, still finding new tears to slip through, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting stargazers to witness something they were never meant to see. Just remember, if you're ever watching the aurora and you hear that crackling sound, don't look for too long. And if you see a white light beneath the curtain of green and purple, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because sometimes the things behind the lights, they look back. Redditor 6. I've held on to this memory for over 40 years now, turning it over in my mind like a piece of sea glass worn smooth by time. Some nights, when sleep won't come and I hear the distant rumble of thunder, I'm transported back to that balcony in Fort Walton Beach where my great-grandmother and I witnessed something that defied explanation, something that changed how I look at the sky forever. It was the summer of 1982, or maybe 83, the years blur together now, and my family had rented one of those towering beachfront condos that line the Florida coast like sentinels. Mom had brought my sister and me down from Atlanta, along with my grandparents and great-grandmother. It was one of those multi-generational trips that seemed to define southern summers, where the humidity hung thick as molasses and the days stretched out endless as the horizon. My great-grandmother was still spry then, despite her advanced age. She had this way of moving that reminded me of a bird, quick and precise, with bright eyes that missed nothing. That evening, she'd invited me out to the balcony to watch the sunset. I remember being excited because usually it was my sister who got to do special things with the adults, but this time it was just me and great-gran. The air was heavy with salt and the promise of rain. Below us, the Gulf of Mexico stretched out like liquid mercury in the fading light, waves crashing against the shore in a steady rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. Great-gran had pulled 2 chairs close to the railing, and we sat there, she in her flowered house dress, and me in my Batman swimsuit that I'd refused to change out of all day. "Listen to that ocean, sugar," she said, her voice carrying that soft Louisiana lilt that always made me think of honey. "That's the same sound your granddaddy's granddaddy heard when he was a boy. Some things never change." But some things do change. Some things change everything. The first boom caught us both by surprise. It rolled across the water like bowling balls in heaven, and I remember great-gran's hand finding mine, her skin paper-thin but her grip still strong. "Storm's coming," she said, but there was something odd in her voice, a note of uncertainty I'd never heard before. The clouds above had gathered into a mass of purple-gray, typical of those sudden Gulf storms that could turn a perfect beach day into chaos. But what happened next was anything but typical. The first flash looked almost normal, like sheet lightning inside the clouds. But instead of fading, it seemed to pool, to gather itself into a point of brilliant white dew light that hung there, defying gravity and everything I knew about how the world was supposed to work. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," great-gran whispered, her fingers tightening around mine. The light descended. It didn't fall like lightning should. It moved with purpose, leaving a trace of itself behind like a cosmic sparkler. And then another light appeared, and another. Soon, the sky above Fort Walton Beach was alive with them, dancing points of impossible brightness that moved with an intelligence that made my 6-year-old brain try to shut down, and they spun and wove between each other in patterns that seemed almost playful, like dolphins I'd seen earlier that day showing off for the tourists. Each light left trails that hung in the air for precious seconds before fading, creating a web of luminescence above the gulf that reflected off the water below, turning the whole world into something alien and strange. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. But Great-Grand's hand in mine kept me anchored to reality as we watched something that shouldn't exist put on a show just for us, and for the dozens of other people who must have been watching from other balconies, from the beach, from their cars on the coastal highway. The lights moved faster now, their patterns more complex. They would dive toward the water, pulling up at the last second in a maneuver that no aircraft I'd ever seen could manage. They'd spiral around each other, split apart, merge back together in a dance that lasted maybe 10 minutes, but felt like both an eternity and not nearly long enough. And then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone, shooting straight up into the clouds with a final boom that rattled the sliding glass door behind us and set off car alarms all along the beach. We sat there in silence for a long time, Great-Gran and I, still holding hands, still staring at the now empty sky. The clouds that had gathered broke apart without delivering their promised storm, leaving behind a sunset painted in shades of orange and pink that seemed mundane compared to what we'd just witnessed. Finally, Great-Gran spoke. "Well," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I suppose some things do change after all." When we went back inside, the rest of the family was gathered around the TV, watching some sitcom and arguing about where to go for dinner. Mom asked us what we'd been doing out there for so long. Great-Gran and I shared a look. "Just watching the waves," she said, and squeezed my hand one last time before letting go. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going to the window, hoping to see the lights return. In the morning, I expected to hear people talking about it at the beach, to see it on the news, to have some adult explain what we'd seen in a way that would make sense. But no one mentioned anything. If others had seen it, they kept quiet, just like we did. Gran passed away the following winter. In her last days, when the morphine made her confused, she would sometimes talk about the lights above Fort Walton. It was like managing in a mystery. But everyone had just confided to the doctor's comment. "They were dancing for us," she'd say, her eyes focused on something far away. "Dancing in the sky like angels having a party." I'm in my late 40s now, with children of my own. We take them to Fort Walton Beach every summer, rent one of those same condos. Every evening, I sit out on the balcony as the sun sets, watching the sky. My kids think it's just a quirky dad thing, but I'm waiting for that boom of thunder that isn't thunder, waiting for the lights to return. Sometimes, on nights when the clouds gather thick and purple over the Gulf, I swear I can feel Great-Gran's hand in mine again, paper thin but strong, anchoring me to reality as we watch the sky together. And sometimes, in that space between lightning and thunder, I see traces of light that hang a little too long, move a little too purposefully. But maybe that's just memory playing tricks, the way it does when you've held on to something for 40 years. Or maybe, just maybe, they're still up there, waiting for the right moment to dance again. I've never researched whether others reported seeing lights in the sky over Fort Walton Beach in the summer of 1982 or 83. Part of me wants to know, to validate what Great-Gran and I experienced, but a bigger part of me wants to keep it just as it is. A perfect moment frozen in time, shared between a little boy in a Batman swimsuit and his great-grandmother, watching something miraculous from a balcony 13 stories above the Gulf of Mexico. Some memories are better left unexamined. Some mysteries should stay mysterious. And some lights in the sky should keep on dancing, if only in our memories. But I still watch the clouds, and I still wait for thunder that isn't thunder. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can see them, spinning and weaving through the night sky, leaving traces of wonder in their wake. After all, as Great-Gran would say, some things do change, and sometimes those changes light up the sky and dance across the waves, reminding us that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we could ever imagine. Redditor 7. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night in Parker's Woods. Sure, Bits and pieces have slipped out over beers, usually met with eye rolls or nervous laughter. But the complete truth? That stayed locked away, fermenting in the dark corners of my mind like the cheap vodka we carried that night. It was Mike who suggested the cave. He'd found it during one of his solo hikes, a shallow depression in the limestone cliff face, just deep enough to shelter 3 drunk idiots from the elements. The perfect spot to get wasted away from prying eyes and noise complaints. Tom wasn't so sure, but that was Tom for you. Ever since his older brother made him watch Fire in the Sky at age 8, he'd developed an almost pathological fear of anything related to aliens or abductions. We used to tease him mercilessly about it, making crop circles in his front lawn or leaving tinfoil hats on his desk at work. "Come on," Mike had said, pulling a bottle of vodka from his backpack as we gathered in my garage. "What's the worst that could happen? Some cave crickets try to make friends?" Tom took a long pull from the bottle, grimacing. "You know what's out there in the woods at night?" "Yeah," I laughed, grabbing the vodka. "Drunk rednecks and horny teenagers, real terrifying." We were already 3 shots deep by the time we hit the trailhead. The October air had that peculiar stillness that comes before a storm, and thick clouds had rolled in to blot out any hint of stars or moonlight. Mike clicked on his flashlight, our only source of illumination, and swept the beam across the trail ahead. "Ladies first," he said, nudging Tom forward. The path was familiar enough in daylight, but darkness has a way of transforming the mundane into the menacing. Every rustling branch became a lurking presence, every snapping twig a footstep. We took turns trying to scare each other, ducking behind trees and making low, inhuman sounds. The vodka made everything funnier than it should have been, and Tom's increasingly nervous reactions only encouraged us. "Did you guys hear about the missing hikers last month?" Mike asked, his voice deliberately casual as we picked our way through a particularly dense section of undergrowth. "They found their backpacks way out here, empty. Not even a granola bar wrapper left." "Shut up," Tom muttered, but I could hear the tension in his voice. "And remember that weird light show people reported seeing?" I added, struggling to keep a straight face. "All those bright lights dancing over the trees? The government said it was just weather balloons, but—" "I swear to God, if you two don't—" A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness behind us, and Tom nearly jumped out of his skin. Mike and I doubled over laughing, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly across the forest floor. The trail narrowed as we approached the cliff face, forcing us to duck down and crawl through what was essentially a tunnel of branches and thorns. Mike led the way, the flashlight beam barely penetrating the dense vegetation. Tom went second, muttering curses under his breath, and I brought up the rear. That's when everything changed. Mike reached the end of the tunnel first. I heard the metallic clatter of the flashlight hitting rocks, followed by a sharp intake of breath and a whispered, "What the fuck?" "Move your ass," Tom grunted, trying to push forward, but Mike had frozen in place, blocking the exit. "Mike, what?" I started to ask, but then Tom managed to shove past him, and I heard his strangled gasp. I scrambled out after them, my heart already racing before I even processed what I was seeing. There, hovering in the pitch-black sky above our heads, were 3 perfectly spaced lights. Bright, unwavering, and utterly silent. The vodka-induced warmth in my blood turned to ice. We stood there, 3 grown men reduced to wide-eyed children, staring up at those impossible lights. They weren't stars. Too bright, too perfectly aligned. They weren't helicopters or planes. No sound, no movement. They just were. "We need to go," Tom whispered, his voice cracking. "Right now." But we didn't move. We couldn't move. I understood then what people meant about deer in headlights. It wasn't stupidity that kept them frozen. It was that primordial recognition of something so far outside your normal experience that your brain simply short-circuits. The lights cast no beam, illuminated nothing but themselves. They hung there like eyes, watching, waiting. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. My skin crawled with the sensation of being observed, studied, catalogued. "Guys," Mike's voice seemed to come from very far away. Do you feel that?" I did, a sort of pressure in my head, a high-pitched whine just beyond the range of hearing. Tom made a sound somewhere between a whimper and a moan. That's when the middle light blinked, just once, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to break whatever spell had held us in place. Tom turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. Mike and I weren't far behind, our feet somehow finding purchase on the rocky ground despite the darkness and alcohol. We ran until our lungs burned, until the stitch in my side felt like a knife wound, until we finally burst out onto the access road that led back to town, and there, spanning the valley we'd just fled through, was a small bridge. 3 street lamps rose above it, their steady glow cutting through the darkness. We stood there, panting, as understanding slowly dawned. Street lamps. Just ordinary street lamps, viewed from an angle that made them appear to be floating in the void. The relief should have been immediate, should have been funny even, but something kept the laughter stuck in my throat, because I know what I felt back there in that clearing. I know what I heard, or almost heard, when those lights held us transfixed, and I know, with absolute certainty, that street lamps don't blink. We never went back to find the flashlight, never tried to reach the cave again. Tom moved away 6 months later, taking a job on the other side of the country. Mike and I still get together sometimes, but we don't talk about that night. We don't talk about how we both avoid that section of woods now, even in broad daylight. And we definitely don't talk about the dreams, the ones where those 3 lights appear again, hovering outside our windows, the ones where they blink one by one like a countdown, the ones where, this time, they don't stay in the sky. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I go online and read about similar encounters. Most are obviously fake, some are easily explained, but a few sound just like our experience. And in those stories, the witnesses always report the same thing. 3 lights, perfectly still, watching, waiting. I keep telling myself it was just the vodka, just our imaginations. Just 3 street lamps on a bridge we hadn't noticed before. But then I remember that blink, that pressure in my head, that sensation of being examined by something vast and alien and patient. And I wonder, what if the street lamps weren't there to light the bridge? What if they were there to hide something else? Redditor 8. I've never told anyone this before, but I'm the reason they died in Roswell. Not just died. I'm why we cut them open, why we violated the first beings to ever reach across time to contact us. And now, I know they died because they were trying to save us. From ourselves. From what I just did. The digital clock on my microwave blinks 3:47 a.m. as I write this. My hands won't stop shaking. The coffee's gone cold, but I can't sleep. Not after what happened 2 days ago. Not after learning what I've done. What I will do. What I've already prevented and caused and will cause again. It started with the headaches, sharp stabbing pains that felt like someone was trying to reorganize my thoughts with an ice pick. I blamed it on stress at first, the grant deadlines at the quantum lab, the pressure to publish. Looking back, I should have recognized it for what it was, them, trying to make contact. The first clear message came at 2:13 a.m. on Tuesday. I remember checking my phone, the blue light harsh in the darkness of my apartment. The pressure in my head had built to an unbearable crescendo, and then silence. In that silence, I heard them. "We have been trying to reach you for 75 years. The voice wasn't really a voice. It was more like knowing. Like memories of conversations that hadn't happened yet. Their thoughts unfurled in my mind like frost patterns on glass, complex and beautiful and terrifying. Your species dissected our first envoy. In what you call 1947 at Roswell. We understand now. You didn't know. Couldn't know. Time moves differently for us. My nose started bleeding. I stumbled to the bathroom, but I couldn't take my eyes off my reflection. In the mirror, I swear I saw something shift behind me. A ripple in reality, like heat waves off hot asphalt. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. We travel backward through time. What you call your future is our past. We have prevented the nuclear extinction of your species 17 times since this conversation began. I laughed then, a harsh, broken sound that echoed off the bathroom tiles. "That's impossible," I said aloud. "We've only been talking for minutes." Time is not linear. You understand this in theory? Your work at the quantum laboratory proves it. But understanding and experiencing are different things. They were right. My research focused on quantum entanglement, on the strange way particles can affect each other instantaneously across any distance. We'd been getting bizarre results lately, correlations that shouldn't be possible, data that seemed to arrive before we ran the experiments. It was me. It had always been me. We need to meet properly. But your species is not ready. You need to develop true telepathy, master temporal mechanics. The paradoxes alone would... They trailed off, and I felt a wave of what I can only describe as cosmic grief wash over me. That's when they showed me what would happen, what had happened, what was happening right now, 75 years ago. I saw the crash. I saw the bodies. Not bodies as we would understand them, but something else. Something that existed in more dimensions than we can perceive. I saw the military arrive, saw the fear and confusion on their faces, saw the scalpels, and I saw myself in my lab 3 days from now, saw the breakthrough I was about to make, the equation that would prove time travel was possible, that would catch their attention across the decades, the equation that would prompt them to send their envoy to Roswell in the first place. Your discovery creates a paradox. To save our envoy, we would have to prevent your breakthrough. But preventing your breakthrough would mean we never send the envoy, never make contact, never save your planet from nuclear annihilation. How many times, I whispered, how many times have we had this conversation? All of them, none of them. Time is not what you think it is. The bleeding had stopped, but my head felt like it was splitting open. On my phone screen, the time read 2:14 a.m. Only a minute had passed. We have spent centuries trying to find a way around this paradox. Your species' destruction and salvation are entangled, like the particles you study. I slid down the bathroom wall, tiles cold against my back. What happens now? Now, you go to your laboratory, you make your discovery, you cause our envoy to be sent, to be dissected, to set these events in motion. Because if you don't, they showed me then, a world where they never came, where no one was there to prevent the nuclear fires. Billions dead, the planet a radioactive husk. Sometimes the only way forward is backward. I haven't slept since that night. How could I? I go to my lab, run my experiments. The data keeps showing up before I start them. The equations are practically writing themselves. By Friday, I'll have proof that time travel is possible. I'll publish. They'll send their envoy. And in 1947, we'll cut them open. The really fucked up part? I think I understand why they chose Roswell now. They needed us to be afraid. Needed us to know we weren't alone. Needed to plant the seed of possibility in our collective consciousness. Because without that seed, without that fear and wonder and guilt, I never would have started my research, never would have made the breakthrough that catches their attention. It's 4:15 a.m. now. The headaches are getting worse. Sometimes I see them in reflections. Shapes that shouldn't exist, geometries that hurt to look at. They're watching, waiting, making sure I follow through. I have to. We all have to play our parts in this cosmic tragedy, because the alternative is extinction. But here's what keeps me up at night, what makes me stare at my ceiling until my eyes burn. What if this isn't the only loop? What if there are others? What if every decision we make creates new branches, new timelines, new paradoxes? What if somewhere, in some when, we got it right? I think I hear them now, not in my head this time, a sound like static and singing coming from my living room. When I turn around, I know what I'll see, the same thing I've seen 17 times since this conversation started. The same thing I'll see for the first time in 1947. Time isn't what we think it is. And I'm so sorry for what I'm about to do. What I've already done, what I'll always do, forever. In Redditor 9, I used to love hiking in the desert. There was something pure about the endless expanse of sand and stone, the way the heat shimmered off distant rocks like a mirage. But that was before. Now, every time I see the desert sunset paint the sky in violent shades of red, my hands start trembling and I taste copper in my mouth. It happened 3 months ago, during what should have been a routine afternoon hike through the Mojave. I'd done this trail dozens of times before, a 6-mile loop that gave you a perfect view of the valley below. The thermometer in my car had read 102 DGF when I'd parked at the trailhead, but I wasn't worried. I had my Camelback full of ice water, trail mix, and enough experience to know my limits. The first 2 miles were exactly what I expected. My boots crunched against sun-baked earth, sending little clouds of dust dancing in the hot air. A lizard skittered across my path, disappearing beneath a creosote bush. Everything was normal, peaceful even, until I rounded the bend near the old mining cave. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another heat mirage. You see a lot of those out here, especially when the sun starts to set. But mirages don't leave 20-foot-long gouges in the earth. Mirages don't scatter twisted pieces of metal across the desert floor like someone had taken a giant hammer to a chrome sculpture. And mirages definitely don't smell like ozone and burning metal. My hands were already shaking as I pulled out my phone to call 911. No signal, of course. I should have turned back right then. Should have run straight to my car and never looked back. But curiosity has always been my worst enemy. I approached slowly, my boots crunching on what looked like fragments of some kind of metallic shell. The object, what I first thought was a crashed experimental aircraft, was about 40 feet long and shaped like nothing I'd ever seen before. The surface had a strange, almost organic quality to it, like mother of pearl but with colors that shifted when I moved my head. That's when I saw the body. It was sprawled face down about 10 feet from the wreckage. Even from a distance, something about its proportions was wrong. The arms were too long, the torso too narrow. I told myself it had to be a test dummy, maybe from some secret military project. But test dummies don't leak iridescent blue fluid into the sand. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I took one step closer, then another. The setting sun cast long shadows across the scene, making everything look distorted and dreamlike. Maybe that's why I didn't notice the humming at first, a low, almost subsonic vibration that made my teeth ache. I was about 20 feet from the body when the light hit me. It came from above, a beam so bright it turned the world white. I felt weightless, disconnected from my body. The last thing I remember was the ground falling away beneath my feet and a voice in my head that felt like ice water running down my spine. When I came to, I was strapped to something cold and metallic. The room, if you could call it that, was filled with a pulsing bluish light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My clothes were gone, replaced by something thin and almost membrane-like that clung to my skin. I couldn't move my head, but I could see them moving around me. They looked almost human, but stretched somehow, like someone had taken a person and pulled them like taffy. Their eyes were too large, too dark, and they never blinked. Their fingers were long and segmented, like pale spider legs. They didn't speak. Not with words anyway, but I could feel their thoughts pressing against my mind like cold fingers probing a wound. They were curious about us, about our bodies, about how we worked. The procedures, I can't call them experiments, that word is too clean, too scientific, went on for what felt like days. Time meant nothing in that place. They would cut and probe and then seal the wounds like they were never there. Sometimes they would show me images, Earth from space, ancient civilizations, future cities burning. I never knew if they were memories or warnings. It wasn't until they moved me to the cell that I realized I wasn't alone. There were others, dozens maybe. The woman in my cell, Sarah, had been there for what she thought was weeks. She was thin and pale, but her eyes burned with a fury I recognized. "We have to get out," she whispered that first night, her voice hoarse from screaming. "They're preparing something big, and we're just their test subjects." We spent days watching their patterns, learning their routines. They weren't perfect. They had blind spots, moments of weakness. And they underestimated us, thought we were just animals reacting on instinct. The plan was simple. Stage a fight, draw them in. They were stronger than us, but they weren't fighters. They relied too much on their technology, their mental abilities. In close quarters, with enough desperation and surprise, we had a chance. When we finally did it, when Sarah threw the first punch and I screamed like I was being murdered, everything happened so fast. They came in, just like we knew they would. 3 of them, their long fingers reaching for us with their paralyzing touch. But we were ready. I went for the legs while Sarah aimed high. They went down hard, their bodies making wet, cracking sounds against the floor. We took their devices, things that looked like twisted pieces of coral but hummed with power, and ran. That's when we heard her, a child's voice, so out of place in this nightmare that at first I thought I was hallucinating again. She was in a cell 3 doors down, a little girl, no more than 8, with eyes that looked decades older. "I know the way out," she said when we freed her. "I've seen it in their minds. But we have to hurry. They're calling for help. She led us through corridors that seemed to shift and change, past rooms filled with things I still can't describe. The whole ship felt alive, like we were running through the intestines of some vast creature. The little girl, she never told us her name, moved with purpose, touching the walls occasionally as if reading something we couldn't see. The engine room, when we finally reached it, was a cathedral of light and sound. Columns of energy pulsed like giant arteries, feeding into a central core that hurt to look at directly. The girl walked straight to a panel covered in symbols that seemed to move and change. "Cover your ears," she said, and then she pressed her small hand against the panel. The sound that followed wasn't really a sound at all. It was like every cell in my body was screaming at once. The lights flickered, died, came back wrong. Alarms started blaring in patterns that made my nose bleed. "Run," the girl said, and we did. What happened next is still a blur. There was more fighting, more running. The ship started shaking apart around us. We found what looked like an escape pod, but there was only room for two. The girl insisted we take it, said she had her own way out. The last thing I saw before the pod ejected was her small hand waving goodbye. We crashed about 10 miles from where I'd parked my car. Sarah and I walked through the desert night, following the stars. When we finally reached civilization, nobody believed us. The military said there was no wreckage, no evidence of anything unusual in the area. Sarah disappeared 2 days later. I haven't seen her since. Sometimes I wonder if it was all a dream, some kind of desert-induced hallucination. But then I'll catch my reflection in a mirror and see the faint scars that weren't there before. Or I'll wake up in the middle of the night, my body humming with that same subsonic frequency. And sometimes, on clear nights, I'll look up at the stars and feel something looking back, watching, waiting, because I know now that we were never alone. And I know that somewhere up there, a little girl with ancient eyes is still helping others find their way home. I don't hike in the desert anymore, but every time I see a shooting star, I wonder if it's really a star at all. And I wonder if somewhere, in some other part of the galaxy, there's another hiker looking up at their own alien sky, trying to find their way back home.